what happened was the increasing global integration of the economy through the 70s and 80s had meant that state capitalism was no longer the most efficient way for capitalists to run an economy. So in the West, the ruling class has moved toward neoliberalism, and in Russia, as the ruling class tried to do the same thing, it opened up cracks in the one-party state, and the state collapsed, but they still moved towards neoliberalism. The state machinery remained intact, though. After a fairly bloodless process, the KGB was renamed. Seems they kept sending people over to spy in America as well, actually, if you look at the news recently. The war in Chechnya was fought in a similar way to the Soviet war on Afghanistan. The old head of the KGB, Vladimir Putin, became the president. Boris Yeltsin was the head of the Russian Communist Party before he became the president of Russia. Compare that to the gulags, the brutal purges of the 1930s, and it's absolutely clear when the counter-revolution against 1917 took place. Nobody had to hunt down Gorbachev and stick an ice pick in his head in order to cement capitalist control of Russia in the 90s. And this theory of state capitalism isn't just a historical thing about understanding the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union. It's actually, and I'm going to end on this really, it actually remains important today. Because the collapse of the Soviet Union, the decline of the communist parties that look to it, give us the opportunity now, for the first time in almost a century, to have an anti-capitalist movement that isn't dominated by a vision of state capitalism as the alternative to capitalism. But the legacy of the Soviet Union is still there. The idea that nationalisation means socialism, which would have made George Bush and Gordon Brown the biggest socialists in world history, by the way. The idea that nationalisation means socialism is still commonplace. The idea that a state-run command economy is socialism still stumps the vision of so many people in the movement. It can lead to that sliding scale vision of state equals socialism to market equals capitalism. All we have to do is nudge things along that scale, which leads to a reformist vision of the world. And also any reformist, anyone who thinks we can win socialism without the working class taking control of the wealth we produce, because their vision is confined by the limits of the state that we live in, because they think socialists can take control without workers taking control, they always slip back towards a state capitalist idea of socialism as the clever people running society on behalf of the many. Now, by developing an understanding of state capitalism, even if it meant accepting that the revolution that had been won by Lenin and Trotsky had been lost, even if it meant accepting that some of Trotsky's writings had been wrong, what Tony Cliff gave us was a crucial ideological weapon in the fight to keep the genuine soul of socialism, the socialism Lenin and Trotsky had fought for, the idea of socialism from below. He helped keep that idea alive by applying Trotskyism to what had happened after the Second World War.
I thought the origins of state capitalism, were actually in Lenin's policies of like grain requisitioning and the repressive kind of things that followed what he called the necessity in the Civil War. And I just wondered, because it seemed as though this was all kind of about kind of pro-Trotskyists, which I agree with, but I also think it's important to recognise he made a lot of mistakes, and there was a lot of hypocritical and ironic things that happened even before Stalin was introduced onto the scene.
You see, also I think this explains what happened in 1989 and 91. The move towards state capitalism was at its most extreme in Russia, but it was part of a general trend across capitalism internationally. The New Deal by Roosevelt, you go through Adolf Hitler, the Third Reich, after the Second World War, India, etc. But there's a contradiction between what is happening, a move towards state capitalism based in nations' national economies, and an increasing globalisation of production and trade. And the contradiction comes out in two ways. First, there is a renewed Cold War in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, which the Russians can't afford, which was the principal tipping point in terms of Gorbachev. But also, in Eastern Europe, a move towards taking Western loans on the belief that the boom in the West would be sustained and they could sell goods to pay off those loans, and a debt crisis arriving in the 1980s, not dissimilar to debt crises in the global South at the same time. And Poland, of course, was the key place the debt crisis hit, and meant austerity measures and resistance. And increasingly in Eastern Europe, actually the economies went into a crisis which is not dissimilar, as I say, from the global South. And in '89, when it all came tumbling down, the important point was the very same people who'd ruled in a state capitalist economy could just change the way they dressed and rule as they rule essentially now. Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia is the most extreme, but all three the key republics, the same people overnight go from being communists to nationalists and fighting each other. But also, if you want to just continue it for a minute, anyone, and I hear people on the left keep going on that somehow China is somehow still a worker state. 5 minutes in China should dispel any notion that China is a worker state. Self-emancipation of the working class is like being in Manchester in 1848. The level of exploitation, let alone corruption, in China is unbelievable. Yes, of course you have a one-party state, but you also have a complete neoliberal economy. The ex-Stalinists are quite happy with this. They can cope with it. Actually, just as like the ex-Stalinist white New Labour as well, didn't they? They ran it for a long time. There's no contradiction here. You're accepting, if you want to argue this actually, you're accepting the idea of neoliberalism, that democracy has to be with the free market. Well, it doesn't, does it? You know, Pinochet wasn't a Democrat who could have the free market. And anyone who's actually arguing that someone like China is in any way a worker state, the negation of the idea of the self-emancipation of the working class at the moment when Chinese workers are going on strike in their masses. You know, you can't have a worker state in which the working class votes with its feet against its own ruling class. It's the negation of Marx's idea of the self-emancipation of the working class. And it's a negation idea of a freedom at the centre of Marx's vision of what socialism is, which is essentially a majority control, workers' control of the economy and society.
So emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class itself, and it is a continuous act. It doesn't stop after a revolution. Coming back to this question about Lenin led to Stalin, Lenin led a Bolshevik party which came to power through a series of strikes and occupations, and as a result crippled the capitalist class and took control of the society. Stalinism rested itself on the barrel of the gun. So if you look at the state capitalist society we have now, like in China or Cuba or North Korea, you can see that the working class is actually under the state control. It does not control the state itself. So one thing is important, that you cannot have socialism in just one country and then call it a society which is fighting against capitalism. Capitalism is a world system. So if you want to fight it, you cannot fight it alone in just one country. Just like you cannot have a strike or an occupation in just one university and hope that you can change the whole of the education system in Britain itself. You have to have a strike which spreads, you have to have an occupation which spreads and links a whole lot of people who are actually not directly involved, not directly oppressed by the system, so that you can fight the system itself. So I think one more thing which always confuses is about the relations of production. I think it has to be related, that where do you find this relation of production? So as Alex Killinicos described, that if you want to find a class, you have to look into a class struggle. So if you are in a class struggle, you will find that those who are with you, fighting with you against the ruling class, then you belong to a class. So a notion of class does not rest itself in like we are all working people, we are just one class. No, we have to be in a class struggle to definitely understand what the class is. So, and that actually means, like I said in the beginning, that if you are in an occupation or if you are in a strike, you can feel that you have to control democratically every moment of that strike. You cannot allow a small bureaucracy, a small set of trade union leaders, a small set of students leaders to control your strike, because your own future is threatened the moment you give that control away. So if you think that something is socialist, then you have to analyze whether really the working class controls the society.